My name is Yvonne Lancaster. I'm 72 years old, a retired school librarian from Charleston, South Carolina. For most of my life, I believed in quiet dignity, patience, and the kind of strength you don't need to shout about. I was the kind of woman who made casseroles for funerals, never expected thank you notes, and always stood behind her husband and son like a shadow. Dependable, invisible, necessary. On the day of my husband Grayson's funeral, the sky was a dull, pewter gray, the kind that makes everything feel heavier. The air, the silence, even the prayers. It had rained just before dawn, so the earth was still damp when they lowered his casket, like it, too, hadn't made peace with saying goodbye. I stood between my son Adam and his wife Clarice. Clarice clutched his arm like she'd never let go, her jet-black hat tilted at a dramatic angle. She dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Adam didn't cry. He never did. He had my father's stoicism and Grayson's pride, a combination that hardened with age. The priest murmured the final words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I felt a stillness fall over the crowd. Friends, neighbors, even Edna, my oldest friend, stood wrapped in a navy shawl, her hands pressed in prayer. The moment should have felt sacred, but I felt hollow, not because of grief, but because something inside me had been cracking for months. Quiet cracks you only hear when you're left alone with the silence. As we turned to walk back toward the waiting cars, I felt the smallest vibration in my coat pocket. My phone. I nearly ignored it. It felt indecent somehow to check a message in the middle of mourning, but I've always had a curious nature, the kind that makes you lean just a little closer to a closed door. I slipped my phone from my pocket and looked down. Unknown. Number: I'm alive. Hide the 100 Blumblett inheritance from our son. I stopped walking. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. I stared at the screen, the world tilting sideways in that strange, unreal way that happens when reality stops making sense. Was this a joke? A scam? I whispered under my breath, barely moving my lips. Who is this? The reply came instantly. They're close. Trust no one, especially not the boy. I must have gone pale because Edna, who had looped her arm through mine, squeezed gently. Are you all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I had. I glanced at Adam, now ahead of me, his tall frame stiff in his tailored suit. He held the car door open for Clarice, who slipped in like a swan on a lake, graceful, composed, rehearsed. He didn't look back once. I'm fine, I lied to Edna. Just tired, but my hands trembled. When we returned to the house, everything was as Clarice had arranged it. Soft jazz playing from invisible speakers, white orchids on every table, a catered spread so polished it looked like a magazine cover. She was always good at appearances. I stood at the edge of it all, feeling like a guest at my own mourning. I went upstairs, slipped into the guest room, and locked the door. I read the message again, then again, and again. If it was from Grayson, then what in God's name had I buried? And if it wasn't from him, then who would know about the inheritance? Only 3 people knew. Me, Grayson, and our attorney, Marshall Breyer. And Marshall was buried 6 months ago after a sudden heart attack no one saw coming. I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to no one. What I found out changed everything. I didn't know it yet, but in that moment, my life had split in 2. There would be before the message, and everything after. If you've ever loved someone so much that their betrayal would destroy your very idea of love, then you'll understand what came next. And if you've ever trusted someone enough to give them your life, your years, your motherhood, and they used it as currency, then this story might feel familiar, because sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we were taught to smile through. So stay with me. What happened in the weeks after Grayson's funeral unraveled everything I thought I knew, about him, about Adam, and even about myself. And in the middle of it all was one quiet decision that saved my soul. I didn't delete the message, and thank heavens I didn't. Because silence doesn't mean surrender. And inheritance is more than just money. Sometimes it's the truth we leave behind, and who has the courage to carry it. If you've ever had to question everything at a time when the world expected you to stay silent, then I invite you to keep listening. This story isn't about revenge. It's about remembering, about reclaiming your worth when everyone else forgets who you are. When I first met Grayson, he was working the night shift at a print shop that smelled of ink and old ambition. I was 26, fresh out of library school, renting the top floor of a crooked house in Billings, Montana. He wasn't particularly tall or handsome in the traditional sense, but there was a steadiness in him, a warmth that settled over you like a wool coat in late October. He brought me flyers once, church bulletins that needed correcting. I returned them with annotations in red ink, embarrassed at how thorough I'd been. He called me Eagle Eyes and offered to buy me a coffee by way of thanks. I declined. Twice. On the third try, I said yes. I always admired persistence that wasn't pushy. We didn't have much back then. He lived in a one-bedroom above a pawn shop, and my paycheck barely covered rent and Campbell's soup. But we built something slow and real. Our dates were walks through dusty bookstores, secondhand diners, late-night talks on porches that creaked under our feet. We got married in the back room of his print shop on a snowy Tuesday with 2 witnesses and a string of lights we borrowed from the church basement. I wore a navy blue dress because white felt like a luxury. He cried during his vows. I didn't, but my knees shook so badly, Edna had to hold my arm. The first few years were lean. The machines broke often, and the clients were slow to pay. I remember eating oatmeal for dinner 4 nights in a row, and once, Grayson sold his record player to buy toner. I told him that was foolish. He said he'd rather lose music than see me go hungry. By the time Adam was born, the business had finally steadied. We moved to a 2-bedroom house with peeling paint and a backyard full of dandelions. I left my job at the library to raise Adam, and Grayson threw himself into expansion, adding machines, clients, even a second location in Missoula. He worked long hours, too long. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with a plate of cold meatloaf and a glass of milk, waiting for headlights that came too late. When Adam got sick that winter, croup, the doctor said, I remember sitting on the bathroom floor with him bundled in my lap, the steam from the hot water fogging the mirror. Grayson didn't make it home until dawn. He apologized. I said it was fine. That became a habit between us, the quiet exchange of neglect and forgiveness. Still, we had our moments. Sunday breakfasts with the radio on, spring days spent painting the porch, reading together in bed, our hands brushing when we turned the pages. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Adam grew quickly, with his father's brows and my stubborn chin. He was smart, clever even. Grayson wanted him to take over the business. I hoped he'd become a teacher or maybe a writer, something gentle. But sons are not clay. They grow into shapes of their own, even when you think you've molded them carefully. When Adam turned 16, he started spending more time at the shop. I noticed how Grayson lit up when he came in, how he deferred decisions to him more and more. I stayed quiet, told myself it was a good thing, a legacy, a bond. But sometimes, when they talked over dinner about numbers and suppliers, I felt like wallpaper, present but unseen. We moved to Charleston in our 50s, after selling the shops to a larger firm. Grayson called it retirement, but he couldn't sit still. He invested, advised, consulted. I returned to part-time work at the local library, reshelving history books and answering questions from schoolchildren who reminded me of Adam at 7. In that final decade, Grayson slowed down, but he never truly stopped. There was always a meeting, a call, a deal on the horizon. He grew more guarded with age, quieter, more private. I chalked it up to getting older. I should have asked more questions. Our love wasn't cinematic. It was made of grocery lists, tax returns, winter colds, and silent car rides after arguments. But it was consistent. And that's what I mourned most. The constancy. The shared history. The person who remembered how I liked my eggs or the way I flinched during thunderstorms. The last night before his heart attack, we'd argued. Something small. He'd forgotten to refill my prescription, and I'd snapped. He'd said, "You don't have to remind me of everything," and walked out to the porch. I stayed in the kitchen, hands trembling as I washed the dishes. We didn't speak before bed. At 3:17 a.m., I woke to a crash. He was on the floor, pale and gasping. I called 911, held his hand, whispered prayers I hadn't said in years. The paramedics worked quickly. I rode with them, numb. In the hospital waiting room, a young doctor with kind eyes came out and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lancaster. He didn't make it." I remember nodding. I remember thanking him. And I remember the way the world seemed too quiet after that. I thought I had buried 45 years of love and memory in that casket. But now, with one message, everything had unraveled. Had it all been real? Or just a long chapter in someone else's plan? Grayson used to say that legacy is what you leave behind when no one's watching. But what if he had been watching me, even now? And what if his final words were not those whispered in the dark, but hidden in a phone buzz I almost ignored? I closed my eyes, and for the first time in days, I let myself cry. Not just for the man I'd lost, but for the woman I had been, and the one I might have to become. I used to believe that Adam's heart was just like his father's, soft in quiet places, stubborn only when it mattered. As a child, he was always asking questions, always reaching for my hand. I remember once, when he was 7, he asked me if people stayed good forever, or if they grew out of it. I told him kindness was like a garden. It needed tending. But gardens can be overtaken by weeds if no one's looking. Adam changed slowly, like the seasons. In his early 20s, he still hugged me before leaving the house, still called just to say he'd made it home safely. But I began to notice how his eyes lingered a little longer on price tags, how he spoke about people in terms of what they could do for him. He started dressing sharper, investing in cologne that cost more than our monthly grocery bills once did. I told myself it was just youth, ambition, the kind of hunger his father had once carried too. Then he met Clarice. She arrived at our home one Thanksgiving with high heels that tapped out her superiority before she even spoke. Her smile was practiced, polite, her handshake too firm, her perfume too loud. She kissed my cheek like we were already in a power game, and somehow I'd already lost. Clarice came from money, or so she let us know within the first 10 minutes. Her father had been some kind of oil executive, her mother a boutique art dealer. She went to Stanford, studied finance, and worked in wealth management. "I help people grow what they've already got," she said, sipping her wine. "It's all about timing and positioning. Assets don't lie." Grayson said she was sharp. I said she was cold. Adam laughed and said I was being too sensitive. That winter, I heard them arguing in the guest room, something about a trust fund. The next morning, Clarice smiled wide at me and asked if I'd ever thought of consolidating our estate into a living trust. For ease, you know, in case you and Grayson ever get to that age. That age, as though it were a threshold we'd crossed without knowing. I tried to brush it off, but something gnawed at me. After they left, I asked Grayson if we should talk to a lawyer. He looked up from his newspaper and said, "We've got plenty of time, Vonnie." That was always his answer. Plenty of time. As though time ever asks permission. The wedding came quickly, a destination affair in the Keys. Sand, sunset, an officiant who looked like he'd just stepped off a cruise ship. Clarice wore a gown that glittered under the sun, and Adam looked at her like she was already a victory. They didn't ask me to give a speech. I wasn't even seated at the family table. Back home, the calls became fewer. Clarice was always busy. Adam was always just stepping into a meeting. I sent care packages. I left voicemails. Some were returned. Most weren't. I remember one dinner when they visited, about 3 years into their marriage. I'd made pot roast, Adam's favorite. Clarice pushed it around her plate and then mid-bite said, "Have you and Grayson considered assigning durable power of attorney? It's the smart thing to do, especially before cognitive decline becomes an issue." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. Grayson chuckled uncomfortably and said something about still having all his marbles. Adam, to his credit, said nothing, but he didn't correct her, and that silence said more than words could. After they left, I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, watching the steam rise from the dishwater. I wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside me had shifted. I no longer recognized the boy who once cried when he found a dead bird in our backyard, the one who used to sneak into our bed during thunderstorms and beg for stories about how I met his father. I saw less and less of that boy with each passing year. In his place stood a man shaped by cold rooms and conference calls, by spreadsheets and succession plans. Clarisse only reinforced that. She treated life like a ledger, and people like line items. She spoke in forecasts and liabilities, rarely in feelings. When Grayson was hospitalized briefly for a hernia, she emailed instead of calling. "Let me know if this affects the estate planning timeline," she wrote. I began to wonder if her marriage to Adam was a merger more than a union, and if so, what exactly had they been merging? When Grayson passed, Adam took charge of the funeral arrangements. Efficient, curt, precise, he scheduled everything down to the minute. Clarisse stood beside him like a statue, only nodding. At one point, I overheard her say, "This is moving faster than expected." I wanted to ask what she meant, but I already knew. Still, there were moments when I tried to remember the boy he had been, the one who held my hand at the grocery store, the one who once made me a card that said, "Best Mom in the Universe," with glue and glitter. I tried to convince myself he was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the marble suits and icy smiles. But that morning at the funeral, when I caught him glancing toward the donation box like it was a lockbox, something inside me curled in. It wasn't grief that shone in his eyes. It was calculation. And suddenly, the message made a little more sense. Not all of it, but just enough to make my spine stiffen and my pulse quicken. "They're close," the message had said. "Trust no one, especially not the boy." I wanted to be wrong. I prayed I was wrong. But prayers, like gardens, require tending. And I hadn't prayed in a long, long time. There's a certain way your children speak to you when they think they know better. It's not always cruel, not always loud. It's in the smile that's just a little too tight, the tone that slips into condescension, the way they say "mom," as if it's synonymous with "you wouldn't understand." It started with the brochures. Clarisse sent them in a cream-colored envelope with a sticky note that read, "Thought you'd love this. All-inclusive, 24/7 care, private balcony views." I opened it while Grayson was trimming the hedges. It was for a luxury retirement community in Spokane, full of manicured walking trails and yoga rooms. A photo of a smiling woman in her 70s holding a glass of champagne stood beside the slogan, "Retirement Refined." I placed the brochure on the counter and didn't mention it. The next day, Adam called. "Did Clarisse send over the brochure? You'd love it there, Mom. They've got everything." "We have everything here," I said quietly. "Come on. That house is too big now. You two shouldn't be climbing stairs, worrying about roof leaks. This way, you can just relax. Relax." I had never worked so hard for anything in my life as I had for that house. Every beam and floorboard was ours. Grayson had sanded the banisters by hand. I painted the walls between night shifts at the clinic. Adam's baby handprint was still pressed into the cement slab out back where we laid the patio. When I told Grayson, he shrugged. "They mean well," he said, wiping grease off his hands from the garage. "Maybe they're worried." "They're calculating," I replied. "There's a difference." Grayson smiled faintly, but didn't argue. A week later, Clarisse stopped by with matcha lattes and her usual air of polished superiority. She strolled through the living room as though inspecting it for resale. "You know," she said, setting her drink down without a coaster, "if you ever think about downsizing, now's a good time. Housing market's peaking. You could make a clean exit, lock in gains, then let us handle the paperwork." I stood there, arms crossed. "You want us to sell the house?" She raised her eyebrows. "I want you to live easier and safer. Adam worries. You're still driving at night, managing the books. At your age, that's a lot." "Then don't worry. I'm not dead yet," I said. That shut her up. But the following Sunday, Adam arrived unannounced. Clarisse waited in the car, scrolling through her phone like this was just another stop between errands. Adam came in holding a folder. His face was a mixture of eagerness and urgency. "Dad," he said, "Mom, I want to talk to you about something serious." Grayson looked up from his crossword. I put down my knitting. Adam sat down, opened the folder, and slid 2 sheets of paper across the table. "This is an updated life insurance policy. I've been speaking with a financial advisor. We realized Dad's current coverage is outdated. With your health history, Dad, this could be a smarter choice." Grayson picked it up, squinting at the fine print. "Why is the value so high?" he asked slowly. "It's a $100 million policy," Adam said. "Fully covered by me. You wouldn't pay a dime. It's about protection, long-term security. Clarissa and I are planning ahead, that's all." Grayson glanced at me. I said nothing, but my chest tightened. "I'm not sure why it needs to be so much," he said, tapping the paper. "Feels inflated." Adam leaned forward. "It's just positioning, Dad. It makes tax shielding easier down the road, consolidates estate complexities. The payout would be structured into a trust." "That you control?" I asked. Adam blinked, then smiled too fast. "No, not exactly. Mr. Brantley would manage the trust." "Mr. Brantley?" Grayson asked. A knock came at the door. Adam stood up as if on cue and opened it. A man entered in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. "Good afternoon," he said, extending his hand. "Douglas Brantley, estate law." I didn't shake his hand. Grayson did, hesitantly. Mr. Brantley sat with practiced ease. "This is just preliminary, of course. Nothing binding. We just want to walk you through some strategic options to maximize your holdings and minimize future burdens." "Burden to who?" I asked. "To your beneficiaries, ma'am." Grayson looked down at the papers again, then at Adam. "You think we're a liability?" "No, Dad," Adam said. "I think you've worked your whole life. You deserve not to worry. And if we plan smart now, we can avoid surprises later." Grayson folded the document and slid it back across the table. "I've had enough surprises lately." Adam's jaw clenched. Clarisse honked from the car outside. Mr. Brantley gathered the papers without a word. As they left, Adam kissed my cheek and whispered, "We're trying to help you." I didn't answer. Grayson closed the door and stood still for a long time. Later that night, we sat in the living room without turning on the lights. The shadows wrapped around us like a blanket no one asked for. He finally said, "I don't like the way they look at us. Like we're assets, not people." I reached over, placed my hand on his. "We're not going anywhere, Gray. Not yet." The wind howled softly outside. In the dark, we were still a team. But the ground beneath us had started to shift, and I began to wonder, when your children try to manage your life for you, is it out of love, or is it preparation for ownership? Grayson died on a Tuesday. The house was quiet, unusually so, as if it had held its breath before the moment arrived. I remember the sun hadn't yet reached the porch, and I was in the kitchen steeping his favorite tea, chamomile with 2 drops of honey. He said it calmed his nerves before work. When I carried the cup down the hall, the door to his study was shut, which wasn't unusual. He liked to start early, sometimes scribbling notes on yellow pads, sometimes just sitting there staring at old invoices from the print shop we'd sold a decade ago. He said they helped him think clearly. I knocked. No answer. I opened the door. Grayson was slumped forward in his leather chair, head resting unnaturally on his chest, one hand hanging over the armrest. His reading glasses had slipped halfway down his nose. At first, I thought he'd fallen asleep. I said his name softly, then louder. When I touched his shoulder, it was cold. His skin had the pale bluish tinge of someone no longer breathing. I don't remember if I screamed or whispered. I just remember dialing 911 with shaking hands and the teacup falling to the floor, shattering into tiny amber-tinted pieces. The paramedics arrived first, then the coroner, then, within the hour, Sheriff Bill Radley, an old friend of Grayson's from their Rotary Club days. He took off his hat when he stepped into the house, looked at me with that too polite kind of pity I couldn't stand. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said gently, "there's no sign of struggle, no trauma. I'm very sorry, but all things point to cardiac arrest." Cardiac arrest. As though my husband of 45 years had simply been unplugged, I nodded, numb. They didn't take him away immediately. I was allowed to sit with him. I held his hand and noticed the indentations from where he'd clenched a pen too tightly. His lips were slightly parted. There was no note, no warning. When Adam arrived, he didn't ask many questions, just held my shoulders, squeezing too hard. Clarisse came an hour later, smelling like expensive perfume and irritation. "I had to cancel my meeting in Seattle," she said flatly, glancing at the scene with more curiosity than concern. Grayson's body was still in the study when she began making calls. By nightfall, arrangements were already in motion. Clarisse had somehow secured a burial plot, contacted a funeral director, and chosen flower arrangements that she insisted were appropriate for a man of dignity. Adam sat beside me that night on the couch, his voice soft. "Mom, I don't want to put you through any more pain." "I spoke with Sheriff Radley. There won't be an autopsy. Dad deserves to rest in peace without being sliced open. You understand, right?" I stared at him. "No autopsy?" "It's cleaner this way," he said. "Dad wouldn't have wanted his body poked and prodded. We all know what happened. Heart failure. He was under stress." Under stress, yes. But Grayson was meticulous about his health. He walked every morning, took his prescriptions on time. We had just seen Dr. Chow for a full checkup the month before, and everything had come back normal. Still, I nodded. Because what does a widow say, really? The world suddenly treats you like glass, and any protest sounds like madness wrapped in grief. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, less than 48 hours later. Too soon, I thought. Too efficient. But everything unfolded quickly. Clarisse insisted on handling the details. "We don't want Mom to stress," she told Adam, as though I'd ceased being a person and become a burden. She chose the chapel, the suit, even the casket, mahogany with brushed nickel handles. I stood in the corner of the funeral home as she finalized the order of service. Adam stood beside her, nodding dutifully. At home that night, I wandered into Grayson's study. It was clean, too clean. Someone had come in and tidied everything. Files reorganized, coffee mug gone, drawers closed and locked. I searched for his planner, the little leather book he always scribbled in. It was gone. I sat in his chair and stared at the room until the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. The next morning, Sheriff Radley came by with the final paperwork. "Cause of death, myocardial infarction," he read aloud, holding out a thin envelope. "That's it?" I asked. "Unless you'd like to contest," he said, but his voice made clear he expected I wouldn't. I didn't sign the paper immediately. I read every word, each line etched with bureaucracy, cold and definitive. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Yvonne, sometimes the kindest thing is to let people go gently." After he left, I folded the paper and tucked it into the drawer next to the stove, where I used to keep Grayson's favorite jam. Later, while I sat on the porch alone, Adam joined me. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I'm upright." He looked out at the yard. "He went peacefully. That's what matters." But it didn't feel peaceful. It felt orchestrated, too smooth, too fast. "I'll never get to ask him what he was thinking," I said, "what he knew that I didn't." Adam touched my hand, but it felt like the gesture of a stranger. "He trusted you, Mom. That's why he left without saying goodbye." That night, I dreamed Grayson was calling from the next room, his voice muffled but insistent. I got up, followed the sound, but every time I opened a door, he was just one room farther, always just out of reach. When I awoke, the sun was rising, soft and pale. Grayson was still gone, and I was beginning to feel watched. It came 2 days after the funeral. I had just returned from the grocery store, the quiet of the house swallowing me again. I left the brown paper bags on the counter, took off my shoes at the door like I always did, and headed to the living room to open the windows. September had brought a strange warmth to Montana, warm enough to sweat in the sun, cold enough to shiver in the shade. I paused at the window ledge, my hand on the curtain, when I felt the familiar buzz in my pocket. I didn't want to look. I had been half hoping the first message was some cruel joke, a mistake, something easily explained. But there it was. Same unknown number. Same jagged shiver through my spine. They're trying to kill you next. Don't eat or drink anything they give you. The words might have been absurd, hysterical even, if they didn't make a terrifying kind of sense. I stood still, reading them again and again. My palms turned cold. I thought of that teacup falling to the floor the morning Grayson died, of how he never got to take a sip. I thought of Clarice's efficient planning, Adam's insistence on skipping the autopsy. Too clean, too fast. I walked slowly to the kitchen and unpacked the groceries, my mind floating somewhere above my head. I didn't know what to believe, but I wasn't ready to dismiss anything. That evening, Clarice showed up unannounced, her stilettos clicking on the hardwood like gunshots. She held a white pastry box tied with silver ribbon and wore a grin too wide to mean anything good. "Thought you could use a little sweetness," she said, placing the box on the kitchen table like an offering. "It's from Brûlée, that fancy French place on 5th. Almond tart, your favorite, right?" I stared at the box. My throat clenched. "Grayson hated almonds," I said gently. She laughed, flicking her hair back. "Oh, come on. You've always had a sweet tooth. It's from their signature line. Won't take no for an answer." She untied the ribbon and opened the box herself, slicing a perfect wedge with a plastic knife she'd brought in her purse. Who carries a knife for dessert unless they've planned it? "Just a bite," she urged. "I'll join you." She didn't eat hers. She placed it on a porcelain plate, then leaned back with her phone, texting with that same tight smile she always wore when she was pretending to be present. I held the fork in my hand. My mouth had gone dry. My stomach clenched. "I'm actually fasting today," I said calmly. "Old habit. Helps with the stress." She raised an eyebrow. "Fasting? Since when?" I smiled back. "Since grief started tasting bitter." Clarice made a little noise, half sympathy, half boredom. "Well, don't let it go to waste. I'll leave it here." She left the tart on the table and kissed the air near my cheek before heading out, her perfume lingering long after the door shut. I waited 15 minutes before dumping the slice into the trash, carefully wrapping it in the box and sliding it into the outside bin. An hour later, Adam called. "Clarisse said you weren't feeling well. You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." There was a pause. "You should come stay with us for a few days. The house must be feeling heavy." It was the tone, not the words, but the tone, the same one he used when convincing Grayson to sign the insurance forms. Soft, rehearsed, like coaxing a child to take medicine. "I think I'll stay here a little longer," I said. "You sure?" he pressed. "We could help you sort things out. Clarisse has some ideas for how to manage the estate, make things simpler." "Things are already simple," I said quietly. He sighed. "Okay, Mom, just don't isolate, okay?" I said I wouldn't, but the truth was, I already had. That night, I locked every door twice. I turned off the lights but left the hallway lamp on. My mind drifted back to Grayson again, his pale lips, the coldness of his skin, and the message. Don't eat or drink anything they give you. I had told no one about it, not even Doris, my neighbor of 15 years who knew every corner of my life. But the next morning, I found myself knocking on her door. She opened with her usual warm smile, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're up early. Come in, sweetheart." I sat at her kitchen table, watching her pour 2 cups of coffee. When she handed me mine, I hesitated. She noticed. "Something wrong with my brew?" she teased. "No, just stomach's been funny." She sat down across from me, studying my face. "You've got that look?" "What look?" "The one you had when Adam broke his leg on the trampoline and you knew he was lying about how it happened." I didn't answer. "I saw her come by yesterday," Doris said gently. "Clarisse." "She brought me a tart," I said. "That's a first." I nodded. "Grayson hated almonds." "She knows that." "She insisted." Doris sipped her coffee and narrowed her eyes. "You didn't eat it, did you?" I shook my head. "Good." Something passed between us, unspoken but sharp. "I think they're watching me," I whispered, "and I think Grayson knew something before he died." She didn't ask how I knew, didn't tell me I was imagining things. She just said, "Then you need to be careful. Quiet, but careful." I left with a strange mixture of fear and clarity. I didn't know who to trust, but I knew now I wasn't completely alone. When I returned home, I stood in the kitchen staring at the trash bin. The tart box still sat beneath a pile of coffee grounds and orange peels. I took a photo of it. Then, I opened my phone. The number was still there. I typed, "Who are you? Why are you helping me?" No reply came. But when I opened the study, I found something new. A faint scratch along the edge of Grayson's desk drawer. It hadn't been there before. Something had been opened, or someone had tried. And I knew then I couldn't ignore this any longer. The night after Doris warned me, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the hallway, every shifting shadow on the wall felt like something watching, waiting. Around midnight, I got up. I wandered the house barefoot, drawn by a feeling I couldn't explain, like something unfinished was calling out from inside these walls. I found myself standing in Grayson's study again, the room still carrying his scent, cedarwood, tobacco, and old books. I hadn't stepped fully inside since the day he died. But that night, the air felt different, heavier. I turned on the desk lamp, its amber glow soft and steady. The drawer had been scratched. I remembered that clearly. I knelt beside it. I ran my hand under the bottom panel. For years, Grayson had told me this desk came from a retired judge's estate, complete with hidden compartments and lock mechanisms. I never gave it much thought. But now I pressed gently along the grain of the wood. My fingers caught on a small indent. Click. The floor panel beneath the bookshelf behind his desk shifted, just a hair. I stood up slowly, heart thudding, and pushed the tall oak shelf with both hands. It gave way an inch, then another. Behind it was a small, built-in recess, no taller than my shin. A safe, matte black, with a dial that looked worn from use. Grayson was a printer by trade, but he adored mechanical things, watches, locks, engines. He once taught Adam how to pick a cheap padlock using a paperclip. I stood there staring at the dial, trying to think like him. His favorite numbers. Our wedding date, October 18th, 1974. I turned the dial. 10, 18, 74. The latch released with a quiet pop. Inside was a leather-bound folder, thick with papers, and beneath it, an envelope sealed with wax. My fingers trembled as I reached for the envelope. On the front, in Grayson's unmistakable cursive, were 4 words, "If I die strangely." I sank into his desk chair, the envelope clutched tightly in my lap. My chest was tight. I peeled back the seal. Inside was a single sheet folded twice. Grayson's writing was neat but tense, as if every letter cost him something to write. "My dearest Yvonne, if you're reading this, it means I didn't go gently. I need you to stay calm and keep quiet, for now. I believe Adam and Clarice have been planning something. It started months ago. Odd bank inquiries, legal pressure, suggestions to simplify our estate. You know how I felt about that life insurance policy, but I signed it because I thought it would give you security. Now I fear it may have made me a target. There are 2 things you must do. First, go to Westbrook Bank. Safety deposit box 8 and 12. The key is in the piano bench. Second, look at the DNA file from 1998. You'll find it in this safe. I never had the courage to tell you what it said, but if I'm gone now, you have to know. I love you. More than anything. That never changed. Even after the test, please believe that. Grayson." The room spun slightly. I clutched the letter to my chest and leaned forward, trying to steady my breath. What test? I turned back to the safe and lifted the leather folder. There were documents inside, old medical records, lab reports, and one manila envelope marked 1998. Confidential. I opened it. There it was, a DNA parentage report. Adam Lancaster, age 21, tested against Grayson, Edward Lancaster, and Yvonne Margaret Lancaster. I didn't breathe. The results showed a 0.00% probability that Grayson was Adam's biological father. And under my name, 0.00% probability that I was Adam's biological mother. I dropped the folder. My heart hit the floor before the papers did. No, that couldn't be. That had to be wrong. I picked up the report again, rereading every line. There was no ambiguity. It was clear, final, and signed by the lab director. Grayson had known. All this time he had known. And how could I not have? Adam was mine. I remembered every moment of carrying him. The nausea, the midnight cravings, the way he kicked at my ribs. I remembered the night he was born, January 4th, during a snowstorm so loud it drowned out my screaming. But this test said otherwise. It called my entire life into question. I sat frozen in that chair for I don't know how long. The clock ticked. The shadows shifted. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly lighting the study. When I could finally move again, I tucked the letter and DNA file back into the safe. I locked it. I rolled the bookshelf back into place. Then I walked to the piano and lifted the bench. Inside, beneath some old sheet music, was a small velvet pouch. I opened it. A tiny silver key, safety deposit box 812. Grayson had always been methodical. He never left anything to chance. He must have sensed something long before I did, and instead of confronting it, he prepared for it. He chose to protect me by leaving behind a trail. But what haunted me most wasn't just the implication of betrayal. It was the fact that he still wrote, "I love you." That never changed. What had he endured alone? What had he suspected that I refused to see? Suddenly, so much made sense. Adam's emotional distance, his coldness, the way Clarice always spoke as if they were owed something, as if entitlement ran deeper than love. Maybe it did. And if Adam wasn't mine, or Grayson's, then whose son was he? And who, in this quiet town of Helena, Montana, had handed me a baby that was never meant to be mine? Grayson hadn't just left behind evidence. He left behind a question too devastating to ask out loud. Who is Adam? And what else have I been lied to about? I stood in front of the Westbrook Bank building with the key in my coat pocket, pressing into my palm like it had weight beyond its size. The early afternoon was gray and windless, and the silence of the town made everything feel heavier. I hadn't been here in over a year. Not since Grayson stopped managing our joint accounts in person and shifted everything online. He said it was for convenience, but now I wondered what else he was avoiding. The receptionist recognized me right away and offered me coffee, which I declined. She made a quiet call, then motioned toward the back. I followed the hallway past framed photos of past bank directors, oil paintings of riverfront mills, and dusty railroad depots, fragments of a Montana none of us lived in anymore. Mr. Halston was waiting in his office, just as polished and precise as I remembered. He stood as I entered, a lean man with silver hair and a cautious smile. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said gently, "I was deeply saddened to hear about Grayson." I nodded, unsure what expression my face was wearing. "He trusted you." He gestured for me to sit. He did, for almost 3 decades. I placed the safe deposit key on his desk. His brows lifted slightly. "He told me you'd come one day, though I didn't think it would be under these circumstances." "What's in the box?" I asked. He folded his hands. "Before I answer, I'd like you to know that about 3 weeks before Mr. Lancaster passed, he visited me. Alone. He was tense. Not like his usual self." I leaned forward. "What did he say?" Halston reached into a locked drawer and retrieved a thin folder. "He asked me to isolate $100 million from the broader family trust. specifically to move it into a separate account under a different beneficiary designation. My throat tightened. Different than Adam? Halston gave a small nod. Yes. He insisted it be done privately, no notifications. He even signed a sealed directive, which, per his instructions, was to be given only to you if something happened to him. Did Adam know? The banker hesitated, then cleared his throat. That's where it gets complicated. He opened the folder and passed me a notarized document. Grayson's signature was clear. I read the header aloud. Transfer of isolated assets. Beneficiary redirection. Confidential. Who was the new beneficiary? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He pointed to a name typed in neat black ink at the bottom of the page. Yvonne Margaret Lancaster. My breath hitched. He said you didn't know, but that you would understand later, Halston said. He used the word shield, said the money had to be shielded from pressure. I swallowed hard, my voice dry. Did Adam ever come here, asking about that account? Halston shifted in his chair. Yes. About a week before Grayson came to see me, Adam came in with another man, said he was authorized to review all accounts tied to the family estate, claimed he had his father's legal proxy. The man with him claimed to be their estate attorney. And was he? No. We checked after they left. The documents looked real, but they weren't on file with our legal department. They used temporary POAs, cleverly worded, but not legally binding without Grayson's consent, which we never received. Did Grayson know they came? Halston gave me a look that said everything. That's why he rushed in later. He seemed shaken. He asked me point blank if Adam had tried to access anything he shouldn't. And you told him? I did. And his face. He just sat in that chair, staring for minutes. Then he asked to isolate the funds and change the beneficiary that same day. The room was suddenly too warm. I pulled my coat tighter around me, even though I hadn't taken it off. Mr. Halston, do you think Adam was trying to get that money? The banker's eyes softened. I don't know his motives, Mrs. Lancaster, but I know deception when I see it. Your husband did too. That's why he left you this. He handed me a small sealed envelope. My name was written in Grayson's slanted hand. I opened it slowly. Yvonne, if they're reading this to you, it means I failed to keep them away from it. Don't let them win. This money isn't about greed, it's about control. And we both know Adam has been under Clarice's thumb for years. You still have the power. Use it. Quietly. I looked up from the note, my eyes blurred. What happens now? I whispered. Mr. Halston rested his hands flat on the desk. That depends on you. The account is yours now, quietly registered. But if they push, or if legal action comes, you'll need counsel. I can recommend someone discreet. I nodded slowly, feeling something harden inside me. Not anger, not quite. A kind of clarity. When I walked in here, I said, I thought I was looking for closure, but I think I've found the beginning of something. Halston gave a slight smile. Grayson believed in you. He said, Yvonne sees more than she says. He asked me to remind you of that. As I left the office, the Montana sky had deepened to a heavier gray. I stepped outside into the chill, clutching the envelope and the folder tight against my chest. Adam had tried to take what Grayson built in secret, pretending to speak for his father, trying to get ahead of the will, of the estate, of me. And now the line had been drawn, not in court, not in public, but in ink and silence. And I had just crossed it. It had started to rain as I stepped into the town library. Not a downpour, just a quiet, persistent drizzle that softened the sharp edges of the sidewalk and turned the windows into foggy mirrors. I'd come here under the pretense of returning a book, but in truth, I needed a moment away from the house, from the silence, from my own questions that had begun to echo louder than any voice around me. I walked past the front desk and down the far aisle, the section no one visited anymore, local histories, weather records, bound census books. I liked the hush here, how the carpet muffled every footstep, how the past stayed shelved, untouched. That's where I first noticed him. A tall man in a worn trench coat, standing by the shelf labeled Birth Records, 1900, 1990. He wasn't reading, just standing. Then, as if we'd been meeting here by design, he turned and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said. I froze. "Yes? I'm Gideon Vale," he replied calmly. "I used to work for your husband, Grayson." The air between us shifted. I studied his face. Gray hair, thin mouth, deep lines along his cheeks like roads to something long buried. He didn't look threatening, just exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from work, but from holding on to something for too long. "What did you do for him?" I asked. "Logistics, background vetting, estate risk. We worked together for years, quietly." "Why come now?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, wrapped in a weathered rubber band. "Because your husband asked me to, if certain things ever came to pass. He left specific instructions for me to find you if he disappeared under unusual terms." "Disappeared?" He nodded once. That was the word he used. Not died, not passed. I stepped closer. "What is this?" "The truth," he said, "and I know it won't be easy." I hesitated, then took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. I opened it slowly, careful not to drop anything. Inside were several documents, copies of a DNA test, a hospital intake form, and at the very bottom, a small digital recorder. "What am I looking at?" He gestured to the documents. "That DNA test was ordered by Grayson in 1998. You'll notice the donor is listed only by initials, AL for Adam Lancaster, but the paternal markers, they didn't match." I scanned the results. The numbers meant nothing to me at first, but then I saw it. Paternity index, excluded. "No match," I whispered. He nodded solemnly. "Adam isn't Grayson's biological son." I looked up sharply. "That's impossible. I was there. I gave birth. He held him." "Yes," Gideon said gently. "But do you remember the fire at the hospital in 1987? I blinked. "Of course. The nursery wing was evacuated. Power failure. They rushed the newborns out. There was chaos, but Adam was safe. Or so you were told." He took a breath and continued. "That night, during the confusion, a switch happened. Grayson believed it wasn't random, that someone, maybe staff, maybe someone else, interchanged the infants. Grayson began suspecting it years later when he noticed discrepancies in blood types. That's what led to the DNA test." I stared at the recorder, not yet ready to press play. "And this?" "Grayson recorded that in the weeks before he vanished. He wanted you to hear it. I haven't listened to it. He sealed it for you." My fingers trembled as I pressed the tiny play button. Grayson's voice filled the space, scratchy, but unmistakably his. Calm, deliberate, sorrowful. "Yvonne, if you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you in person. I wanted to shield you, but maybe that was a mistake. Adam isn't mine. I know that breaks something sacred between us. I loved him as if he were, but the facts are facts. They changed his identity that night at the hospital, and I think someone knew. Maybe Clarice, maybe more. Don't trust the surface, Yvonne. Look deeper. They've been planning this longer than you think." The recorder clicked off. I stood frozen. The library felt colder, like the temperature had dropped the moment the words ended. Gideon spoke again. "I've kept this for years. I didn't want to believe it either. But Clarice's involvement isn't impossible. She's connected to the estate's former lawyer. There were transfers, signatures, things that didn't add up." "Why would anyone do this?" I asked, barely able to speak. "For power. Control. Maybe they thought the real Adam wouldn't serve a purpose. Maybe they needed a child with no claim to anything." I clutched the documents, unable to stop my hands from shaking. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "That's your call, ma'am. But I'll say this. Grayson believed in you. He said you'd see what he missed. He said you'd be the one to finish what he started." I took a long breath, trying to still the storm inside me. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was unraveling. My husband had suspected for decades. My son, might not be mine at all. Or rather, might not be his. What did that mean for the years of birthdays, bedtime stories, Christmas mornings, scraped knees? I thought of Adam's coldness, his distance, the sudden ambition, the way Clarice had inserted herself like she already owned everything. Had they always known? Or had this secret turned them into who they were? "Where is the real Adam?" I asked, not expecting an answer. Gideon only said, "I think you'll find more in Grayson's study. Look behind the portrait." Then without another word, he turned and disappeared into the rainy afternoon, leaving me with a recorder, a stack of papers, and a truth that splintered the very foundation of the life I thought I knew. It was nearly midnight when I found the envelope wedged behind the bottom drawer of Grayson's desk. I had gone back into his study on instinct, guided not by logic, but by the gnawing sense that something had been overlooked. The portrait Gideon had mentioned had yielded a key, but no safe. Yet the drawer had stuck halfway when I tried to close it again. It was only then that I noticed the sliver of manila tucked in the dark corner, nearly swallowed by the wood. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of thick, cream-colored paper, our old legal stationery, the kind Grayson only used for personal matters. His handwriting stared back at me, slanted and deliberate. And at the top, Last Will and Testament of Grayson T. Lancaster. I sank into his leather chair, the only thing in the room that still smelled faintly of him. The first lines were standard enough. He named himself in full, declared sound mind. Then, the next line made my chest tighten. To my son Joshua, if ever found, I leave the entirety of my estate, both liquid and real, held in full under my name and trusts established post-1987. Joshua. The name echoed like a bell in a cathedral. Joshua. He had been gone for 30 years, a child we lost to time and sorrow, a boy who vanished after the car accident on Route 9, barely 7 years old. 1 minute laughing in the back seat, the next, gone. The car flipped, the rescue chaotic. Only Adam had been pulled from the wreckage. They told us Joshua was ejected and presumed drowned in the river nearby. Divers searched for days, but his body was never recovered. They called it a tragic loss. We buried an empty casket. But here was Grayson, writing as if he believed our boy had survived. I turned the page. He had detailed instructions. If Joshua was never located, the estate would be frozen in a trust. Not a cent to go to Adam or Clarice. His words were clear. This will shall be activated only upon confirmed identity through medical or genetic validation. No default inheritance is to be assumed by Adam Lancaster or his spouse. My eyes scanned for a signature. The final page held only a date, left blank, and a single note written at the bottom in blue ink. Still confirming. Do not sign yet. The will was real, but not valid. A will not signed is a door never opened. I pressed the pages to my chest and stared out the window, the backyard coated in silver moonlight. All this time, Grayson had been carrying the hope that Joshua lived. All this time, I had mourned one son and molded myself to love the other. And yet something inside me had always felt uneven. There were memories, small ones, that never quite aligned. The shape of Adam's hands, the way he never resembled either of us, the strange inconsistencies in his health records that doctors chalked up to clerical error. But now the weight of it threatened to crush me. If Adam was not ours, and Joshua was still out there somewhere, what life had he lived? I couldn't sleep. I placed the envelope under my mattress, and before dawn, I drove to the county archives. I told the clerk I was researching a family case and needed hospital employment records from the late 1980s. She gave me a tired smile and pointed to the microfiche cabinet. Hours passed. My eyes blurred. But then I found it. A personnel roster from 1987 at St. Helena General Hospital, Emergency Department. There, listed among the nursing staff, Clarice M. Wexler, temporary assignment, 3-month rotation, Terminated, August 1987. My throat dried. That was 2 months after the accident. She had worked at the very hospital that handled the crash, before she ever met Adam, before she married him. Or had she already known him? I photocopied the record and stared at her name in black and white. I thought back to every forced smile, every carefully worded comment about letting the past go, every time she mentioned how Adam had always been strong, as if she'd been watching him longer than any daughter-in-law should have. I sat in my car for a long time after that. My fingers curled around the steering wheel, not out of rage, but disbelief. Had she been part of this all along? Had she seen something that night? Taken part in something? Suddenly, the way she looked at me last week, when I asked about old photo albums, came back with stunning clarity. The quick glance, the subtle pause. She knew, or at least suspected, what I was starting to uncover. Back home, I laid out the will, the hospital record, and Grayson's DNA results. The pieces didn't fit neatly, not yet. But the image forming in my mind chilled me. A child switched or hidden, a fake heir raised in his place, and a family built on a foundation of secrets. I took out our family album, flipping past the pages of birthdays and holidays, searching for something, anything. Then I saw it. A photo from Joshua's 6th birthday, the last one before the crash. In it, he wore a red sweater with a small embroidered whale on the chest. The same sweater I'd found, years later, in a donation box Clarisse had packed when we moved houses. I'd thought nothing of it then. Why had she kept it? A name, a will, a sweater, scattered pieces of a forgotten life. But Grayson had seen through it. He had planned for it, and now, even in death, he was leading me back to what we had lost. I stood up, picked up the unsigned will, and folded it neatly back into its envelope. The paper still held his scent, faint but familiar, as if he were standing just behind me, urging me forward, whispering, "Find the truth." Find our son, and I would, whatever it cost. The invitation arrived in an ivory envelope with my name hand-lettered in black ink, too careful to be Adam's handwriting. Inside, a card embossed with gold leaves read, "In honor of Father, an intimate evening of remembrance. 7 p.m., the conservatory room. No RSVP, no explanation. Just the place and time." I stood staring at the card for a long while. I hadn't stepped foot inside the conservatory room since our 40th anniversary party. Back then, it was filled with warmth, laughter, candlelight reflected off the stained glass, and Grayson's voice echoing as he gave a toast no one remembered for the words, only the way it made us feel. Now the same room was being used to host a remembrance he never asked for, organized by the very people who seemed desperate to bury more than just his memory. Still, I went, not out of trust, out of necessity. I wore my gray wool coat and pinned the old brooch Grayson gave me in Vienna to the lapel. In my purse, beneath the silk handkerchief and a folded tissue, I slipped in a slim recording device I had bought that morning. It was voice-activated, the kind used in lectures or meetings. Small, unnoticeable. I pressed the tiny red button before knocking on the carved oak door. Clarisse opened it herself. She wore black satin and a smile polished to perfection. "How lovely you look," she said, voice sweet as clover honey. "Come in, Mother Lancaster." The room had been set like a private restaurant. White linen, crystal goblets, soft piano music playing from a Bluetooth speaker hidden behind a fern. Adam stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of red wine. When he turned, I noticed his tie was the same one Grayson wore the day we opened the foundation building. Perhaps on purpose, perhaps a careless coincidence. "Mom," he said, coming forward to kiss my cheek, "I'm glad you came." "I'm curious," I replied. "This is a rather grand gesture." He smiled. "You deserve it." "Deserve? Dad would have wanted it." I sat. Clarisse poured the wine before I could object. "Cabernet, from your favorite vineyard," she said. I watched the deep red liquid swirl in the glass. I lifted it, inhaled, not too deeply, and smiled. Smells lovely." They began to speak about Grayson, recalling surface memories, his laugh, his obsession with jazz records, how he overwatered every plant in the house. I responded politely, offering details they forgot or never knew, all while keeping my hand wrapped around the stem of the wineglass, never drinking. My tongue felt thick with the weight of the moment. Clarice excused herself to check on dessert. Adam moved to refill my wine, but I placed my hand over the glass. "Still working on this one," I said. He smiled, but his jaw clenched. When she returned, she carried a plate with a single chocolate tart. She set it in front of me. "Made it myself. You must be hungry." "Very kind of you," I murmured, though I ate a bit before coming. "Nonsense. Try a bite." I cut a sliver with my fork and raised it slowly, then let it fall back onto the plate. "Later, perhaps." Adam checked his watch. "Do you want to say something, Mom? For Dad?" I looked at him. Really looked. The son I'd nursed through measles, the boy I taught to tie his shoes, the teenager I once believed could do no wrong, now watching me like a vulture circling a wounded doe. "No," I said quietly. "I've already said what mattered. To him, when he was still here." He leaned back. "Fair enough." The silence stretched. Clarice rose again, this time walking toward the window. She drew the curtains, then turned to him. "Is she—" Adam shook his head subtly. "Not yet." I turned slightly, pretending to adjust my bracelet. "She hasn't touched the drink," Clarice said under her breath, but not low enough. "You told me she wouldn't suspect a thing." Adam hissed, "Keep your voice down. We'll just wait it out." My heart pounded, but I stayed perfectly still. "I don't want another delay," she whispered. "We've done enough waiting. After tonight, it's ours. All of it." Adam exhaled sharply. "Then stop pushing. Just give her time." Clarice turned, glanced at me, and forced another smile. "Perhaps some music, Mother?" "No," I said, rising slowly. "I think I've had enough remembrance for one evening." I picked up my purse gently, careful not to jostle the device now resting silently inside. Adam frowned. "Leaving already?" "Yes," I said evenly. "I suddenly don't feel very well." Clarice moved toward me. "At least finish your wine. We opened it just for you." I looked her in the eye. "And yet, I'm not thirsty." Adam stepped forward, but I raised one hand, not in fear, but finality. "Thank you. Good night." I walked out before they could stop me, before they could read the change in my eyes. Outside, the air was sharp with autumn chill. I kept walking until I reached the corner, then turned and smiled to myself. I had it. Their voices, their words, their intent, recorded in their own tones. Not a theory, not a suspicion, evidence. I would take no chances now. They would not get a second attempt. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was no longer chasing the truth. I was holding it. I arrived just before sunrise, the sky still bruised with navy and purple, as if the night hadn't fully surrendered. The police station sat quiet and heavy on the corner of Maple and Fifth, its windows glowing with that sterile yellow light that always made me feel both watched and forgotten. I clutched the manila envelope tightly against my chest, the weight of its contents heavier than any grief I had carried so far. Inside, the front desk officer barely looked up. "Help you, ma'am?" "I need to speak to Captain Harriet Monroe," I said clearly. "It's urgent and personal. Captain doesn't take walk-ins. She will take this one." He started to shake his head, but before he could finish, I slid the envelope across the counter. On top was a note with Grayson's name written in bold black letters and a CD labeled Conservatory Room. The officer's eyes flicked down, then up. Something changed. He picked up the phone without another word. 10 minutes later, I was seated in a glass-walled room that smelled faintly of strong coffee and tired carpets. Harriet Monroe entered without ceremony. Late 40s, trim, with hair pinned back and no nonsense in her stride. She didn't offer a smile, but her eyes were awake. That was enough. "Mrs. Lancaster," she said, taking the seat across from me, "you've got our attention. What's in the envelope?" I looked at her directly. Proof of premeditated harm, fraud, financial manipulation, possibly more. My husband Grayson died under suspicious circumstances, but that's only the beginning. She leaned forward slightly, eyes sharpening. I have an audio recording, I continued, taken 2 nights ago. My son and his wife invited me to a so-called remembrance dinner. There were drugs in the wine. I didn't drink, but I did record what they said while they thought I was unconscious. And you have that recording? I nodded. It's in there. So is a copy of a DNA test. It proves the man I raised as my son isn't my husband's biological child. There's a file from Westbrook Bank showing that Grayson tried to move $100 million into a separate account days before his death, an account intended to be walled off from Adam entirely. Grayson died before that transfer was finalized. Monroe opened the envelope carefully. She removed the USB drive first, sliding it into her laptop. As the recording began, I watched her face. She didn't flinch at the voices. At Clarice's silken coaxing, Adam's low reassurances, the words, "After tonight, everything will be ours." She didn't interrupt. She just let it play through. Then she picked up the folded paper and read the DNA results. When she reached the bottom of the second page, her lips tightened. "You're certain these are legitimate?" she asked. "Yes. The originals are in a safe place. Those are copies, and there's more." I pulled a small envelope from my purse. Inside was a notarized letter from Mr. Halston at Westbrook, confirming the visit Grayson had made and the request to separate the funds. It also included a statement that Adam had visited a week earlier with falsified authorization documents. Monroe read in silence. "I know how this sounds," I said. "I know most people wouldn't believe it, but the evidence is there, layer after layer, and I think we're out of time. If they believe I suspect them, and I do, they'll try again. You think your son and daughter-in-law killed your husband? I think they wanted his wealth. I think Grayson discovered something, maybe about Adam, maybe about that night in 1987, and I think whatever he uncovered made him a liability." Monroe turned to the aide standing behind her, a young man in his early 30s with a legal pad and eyes like a hawk. "Start logging chain of custody on all materials," she said. "I want forensic audio on the recording, and I want a background check on both Adam Lancaster and Clarice Heath Lancaster, full spectrum. Get hospital employment records, tax filings, legal disputes, trust paperwork, real estate, everything." The aide nodded and slipped out silently. "I'm initiating a special inquiry," Monroe said, quietly, "for now. You'll be assigned a direct liaison, and I'll have a patrol car pass by your home at random times. Don't accept food or drink from anyone. If either of them contacts you, notify us immediately. And don't confront them. Let us do our job." "Captain Monroe," I said, voice firmer than I expected, "I don't intend to confront them, but I won't hide either. I've lived my entire life thinking my silence was a kind of grace. It wasn't. It was permission." She studied me for a moment. "That changes today." "Yes," I said. "It does." As I stood to leave, she placed a card into my hand. "This has my direct number. You call it any time, night or day." Outside, the sky had lightened into a chalky blue. The town still slept, its windows dark, the sidewalks empty. I stepped into the dawn with no umbrella, no gloves, no hesitation. For the first time since Grayson died, I wasn't just mourning, I was moving. I sat in the cold interview room, fingers curled around the ceramic cup of stale police coffee. Across from me, Officer Monroe laid out a folder labeled Lancaster Addendum. She didn't speak right away. She just slid it toward me, her expression unreadable. Inside were transcripts, statements, evidence. She said quietly, "We found something, Mrs. Lancaster. You need to see this." I skimmed the first page. It was Adam's written testimony, taken after Clarice had been arrested. I couldn't feel my legs. I read the words slowly, each one pressing a dent into my soul. "I've always known I wasn't their real son. I overheard when I was 15. I found a letter tucked behind Dad's bookcase. It was from a Dr. Heller, dated 1998. Said the DNA didn't match." The room tilted, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. He knew. He knew all these years. And still he called me Mom, Let me hold him when he got the flu. Let me give him birthday gifts and pretend. He wrote further. I didn't say anything. I thought maybe they'd disown me if they found out I knew. But Clarice, she understood. She said I should play the long game, that the real power came from being quiet. My hand shook as I turned the page. She told me once, real families aren't about blood, Adam. They're about who gets the pen when the will is drafted. I blinked, hard. The ink on the page blurred into smudges of betrayal. She said if I played along, if I stayed the dutiful son, I could still inherit. She helped me study law, helped me polish my speech, told me to call him Dad with just the right warmth. I thought maybe I deserved something. I'd been living a lie so long it didn't feel like one anymore. I had to close the folder. I couldn't bear another word. Monroe spoke gently. There's more, Yvonne. We believe Clarice started planning years ago. The connection to the 1987 fire, the forged documents, her employment at the hospital. We ran her fingerprints. She altered medical records, more than once. I couldn't fathom how deep it went. 30 years of lies, fabricated love. Was Adam ever really my son? Or just the shell of one built for convenience? I asked quietly. And Grayson? Monroe leaned forward. That's the part you're not ready for, but need to hear. She reached into the folder again and pulled out a sealed envelope. It was addressed in Grayson's handwriting. My throat tightened. We opened it together. Inside was a single sheet and a flash drive. The letter read, Yvonne, if you're reading this, it means you've uncovered what I feared all along, that Adam isn't our son by blood, and that Clarice has twisted the truth for her own design. But I need you to know something else. I suspected Clarice was poisoning me, the almond smell in my tea, the special smoothies. I stopped drinking them weeks before it happened. The night I died, I switched the drinks. She consumed it herself, enough to put her into a dizzy state. While she stumbled out, Adam called 911, assuming it was me on the floor. The body? It wasn't mine. I gasped. The flash drive shook in my hand. Monroe helped me plug it into the police computer. On screen, Grayson's tired face appeared, a day before his death. If this reaches you, love, know this. I had to disappear. It was the only way to protect you and the legacy we built. You always said truth grows in silence. I'm trusting that now. I'm trusting you. My chest heaved with sobs. I didn't even realize I was holding back. He wasn't dead. He had walked away to expose them, in the only way left, silently, strategically. Monroe gave me space, her voice soft. The body was from the county morgue, a John Doe that had never been claimed. Dental records never matched Grayson's. We missed it. We all did. I thought of the funeral, of the ashes I never questioned, of the way Clarice had rushed the whole thing, pressing me into a black dress with 2 short sleeves, saying, let's just move on. Grayson wouldn't want fuss. And Adam, standing there with dry eyes and a folded speech about legacy and continuing the work. I leaned back, pressing my palm flat to the table. So Grayson's alive. Monroe nodded. We're tracking movements under his old pseudonym. He may come forward when it's safe. I whispered, he always was 2 steps ahead, even in grief. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, casting long golden slants through the blinds. I had thought myself a widow, a woman robbed of her legacy, but I was something else now. A woman awakened, a woman who remembered, and the ones who thought I would forget had no idea what was coming. The courthouse smelled of paper and old polish, of 1,000 truths waited on too long. Room 214 was smaller than I expected, with no cameras, no journalists, just wood paneling and worn benches where legacies unraveled in silence. Judge Hartley presided with a firm calmness, her robe hanging like the weight of history. She looked up only once before the hearing began, her gaze locking with mine as if to say, I see you, and I see what this has cost you. Adam sat at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched but eyes evasive. Clarice wasn't beside him. She was in a separate proceeding now, charged with attempted murder and falsifying legal documents. Her absence felt louder than her presence ever had. My attorney, Mr. Warren, stood with quiet strength, his notes few, his evidence watertight. He didn't posture or perform, he simply laid the truth bare. "Your Honor," he began, "we submit 3 primary exhibits. The 1998 DNA test proving Mr. Adam Lancaster is not biologically related to either Mr. or Mrs. Lancaster. The bank statement showing an unauthorized attempt by Mr. Lancaster to transfer $100 million from the estate using falsified power of attorney, and an audio recording captured 2 nights before Mrs. Lancaster presented herself to the authorities." The judge listened without interruption. The audio played through a small speaker. Adam's voice, flat and unmistakable. "After tonight, it's all ours." No one moved. No one blinked. Just the slow, grinding machinery of consequence turning. The defense tried. They questioned the chain of custody, the context of the words, the pressure of grief. They argued Adam had been manipulated by Clarice, that he acted under emotional duress, that he never followed through with the transfer. But the facts remained unmoved. They did not care for emotion. They did not bend for apologies. Warren concluded simply, "Intent is not invisible. It is proven by pattern, by preparation, by silence in the face of deception. My client may not be a woman of flashy means, but she is the legal widow of Grayson Lancaster and the only rightful steward of his estate, until or unless the man himself reappears." I never stood to speak. I wasn't asked to. My silence had already spoken in documents, in affidavits, in the presence of truth finally untangled. When the judge ruled, her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "The court finds that Mr. Adam Lancaster, having knowingly concealed his lack of biological relation and having attempted to assume ownership of the Lancaster estate through fraudulent means, is hereby removed from all beneficiary status. Furthermore, as Mr. Grayson Lancaster has not appeared nor confirmed his living status in a legal capacity, the estate shall remain under interim conservatorship by Mrs. Yvonne Lancaster until such time as additional evidence surfaces." The gavel didn't echo. It landed like a sigh, soft and absolute. I turned slightly. Adam was frozen. Not angry, not broken, just hollow. He didn't look at me. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he finally saw what he had traded for a fortune that was never his to claim. Outside, the air was brighter than it had been in weeks. Mr. Warren walked beside me without a word. At the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed with questions, but they were quickly pushed back. I gave them no quote, no expression. What happened inside that courtroom would not be for headlines. It would remain what it was always meant to be: a reckoning. Quiet, complete, and painfully just. As I reached the car, I glanced back. One of the court officers held the door open for Adam, who was being escorted out for further questioning regarding financial misconduct. He looked older now, not by years, but by the weight of knowing what he had never truly possessed. Inside the vehicle, I rested my hand on my lap, where Grayson's old fountain pen still lay, the one he used to sign every contract, every letter that mattered. He never signed the last will. Maybe part of him always knew the truth would come out in another way. And so it had. Not in fanfare, not in vengeance, but in a courtroom with no cameras. Just law, legacy, and a woman who had finally remembered everything. The sun rises differently here now. Not in haste, but in hush, spilling golden light over the wild rosemary, the winding stones, and the bench beneath the old elm where I sit each morning with tea in hand. The air smells faintly of cedar mulch, and something older, something like memory. The printing press is long gone, but its bones remain beneath the soil. The bricks once blackened by ink now cradle orchids. The floor where Grayson used to walk back and forth, drafting proposals, now hosts rows of lavender and white peonies. We call it the garden named Grayson. It wasn't my idea at first. Mrs. Edna, from the neighborhood council, suggested I do something with the old warehouse. She said it with that firm kindness older women reserve for each other when they sense something needs tending, grief perhaps, or the aching space it leaves behind. So we built a garden. Not a manicured one, not something stiff with fountains and gates, but a living, breathing refuge. I used to think Grayson's legacy would be documents, balance sheets, or the way his name appeared on corporate letterheads. But now it grows in vines and petals, in laughter from the school children who come on field trips, in silence from those who just need to sit. This morning I steeped 2 cups of tea. I always do. I placed the second on the opposite side of the bench. Some days I imagine Grayson reaching for it, murmuring about the scent of mint or the odd weather forecast. On other mornings, I just let the cup cool beside me. Both ways feel honest. The newspaper still arrives at 6:30 sharp. Old habits are slow to leave. I skim headlines, skip finance sections. I read letters to the editor, gardening tips, obituaries. I notice how the world keeps spinning, sometimes cruelly, sometimes beautifully, always indifferently. It's strange. What doesn't haunt you? I thought the courtroom would stay with me. The declarations, the silence after the verdict, the weight of vindication. But it passed like a heavy storm, necessary but not permanent. What remains are the smaller things, the sound of birds brushing against the window at dawn, the way my hands remember the rhythm of kneading soil, the shape of Grayson's initials still etched into the side of the stone sink we salvaged from the warehouse. Yesterday, a little girl named May came with her grandmother. She couldn't have been older than 6, with 2 messy braids and curiosity stitched into every step. She wandered off the path and touched the sunflowers like she was greeting old friends. "Do flowers talk?" she asked me. I told her yes, but only to those who listen. Mrs. Edna laughed. "That's why your garden's blooming," she said. "You finally stopped talking over everything." She wasn't wrong. For years I tried to outtalk my pain, explain it, justify it, package it into something digestible, but healing didn't come through answers. It came through presence, through the act of showing up, here, each morning, tea in hand, ears open to wind and wings. The garden is open to anyone now. No admission, no names taken, just a small wooden sign at the gate. Grayson's Garden, a place to sit still. A few people know the story. Most don't. Some suspect, of course. Salem isn't a city that forgets easily, but the point isn't remembering the scandal. The point is remembering the man, the life before all that, the quiet mornings, the laughter that came easy when we were young. Sometimes people ask if I ever heard from him again. Grayson, I mean. I never answer directly. Some things are allowed to remain unanswered. But every once in a while, when I step into the tool shed to fetch the watering can, I find something slightly moved, a trowel no one borrowed, a seed packet I could have sworn I hadn't bought, and once a tiny ceramic owl perched on the fence, the kind he used to collect. I say nothing, just smile a little to myself. This afternoon, a young woman came by. She wore a vintage dress and carried a sketch pad. She introduced herself as Ellie, a granddaughter of a woman Grayson had once mentored. "He used to tell my grandma, 'Work hard, but always save your best ideas for Sunday,'" she said. That sounded like him. She asked if she could paint the garden. "Of course," I said. "Just listen while you do it. The place tends to whisper back." As she settled near the rosemary hedge, I returned to my bench, the same one that faces east. The tea was still warm. The birds had returned. I watched the light shift across the garden beds, touching each bloom like a benediction. Somewhere beyond the gate, the world kept on arguing about money, power, inheritance, names on plaques. But here, in this walled garden of earth and sun, I could finally breathe. I closed my eyes. The wind moved like breath over the leaves, and for just a moment I heard him again. A chuckle. The rustle of newspaper pages. Then silence, the kind that heals instead of hurts, the kind you can grow something from.